Hello and welcome to the Single Malt Frontier, where we explore the edge of innovation in American single malt whiskey, as well as other interesting topics that come up along the way. Here on the show, we do a little bit of tasting and a lot of talking. Usually we talk about whiskey, but the best thing about whiskey is the conversations we get to have along the way, and we get to talking about a little bit of everything. I'm your host, Doug, or as I'm known around the internet, Demi Tastes. I'm joined today, as usual, by my co-host, Phil, the Ranger's Respite. Um, We've been on hiatus for a couple of weeks while we focused on some admin stuff and some personal projects. For instance, the Virginia Whiskey Tournament, which we'll talk more about in a moment. But we felt this was a good week to come back and do a just chatting style live stream while we sort of organize the next phase of content. We were recently challenged by one of our regular listeners, watchers, Jerm from Freedom Malts, to do this 7 most interesting bottles challenge. So Phil and I have both made a list. We don't necessarily know what's on each other's lists, or at least we haven't paid that much attention as we were sort of figuring out what fits the rules. And that's kind of an interesting thing that we'll get into a little bit too. So we'll trade off telling you about our selections as we go. So before we get into that, I felt that first it would be appropriate for us to talk a little bit about some aspects of diversity, because it is, after all, Pride Month. So I've alluded to this before, I think, when I did the ACSA Craft Spirits Convention wrap up, but I don't think I showed the slide. So I want to show the slide today that talks about the breakdown of diversity in craft spirits. So I'm going to just bring that up real quick. This one here. So happy Pride, everyone. It's a great time to celebrate diversity. ACSA, the American Craft Spirits Association, is the professional organization for craft distillers in the United States, and they collect some cool data about what they're up to. There was a whole slideshow presentation, and one of the slides that they were all very interesting from technical perspectives, but this one in particular blew me away. So this is a little confusing to read at first, so I'll talk you through kind of what it means. The data is a little bit out of date. This was presented in February 2024, and this is data from 2021 and 2022. So just a tiny bit out of date, but either way, showing the trends across the industry. And they did an ethnic breakdown, which is also interesting. And I think I have that available to show as well, but I zoomed in on this part because just the most relevant to here, and the thing that really shined to me through this whole presentation, was this right here. So the way that you read this slide is you look on the x-axis for the label that it is, and the y-axis is the percent of US craft distilleries who employ at least one person who identifies as that label on the x-axis. So what this means basically is we went from presumably 100% of distilleries employed at least one male, and in 2022, it was 98% of craft distilleries employing at least one male. And that's interesting because that sort of highlights there's a segment of the industry where it's perhaps all women-owned distilleries, or just that by happenstance, there are no men in the employ of a given distillery. And that's kind of an interesting, this number going down is probably the only one of these things that you would celebrate going down, right? That this number means an increase in diversity, because distilling is overwhelmingly dominated by men. Unfortunately, to the left of that, you have that there was a slight decrease in the number of distilleries that employ at least one female. But more of interest is the transgender female, transgender male, and non-binary populations represented here. So the lowest one of those bars that's actually labeled, I don't have the numbers for the rest of them, so you can sort of just imagine by scaling it in your head. I think this one on the right is probably close to 50%, for example. So at least the percent of US craft distilleries who employ at least one person who identifies as transgender female, 30%. That's a huge number to be the smallest number on this graph. This isn't saying this is the demographic breakdown of craft distilling in general. These distilleries employ a lot of other people, but this is probably the best way to highlight these numbers with just a larger, like you can really see the impact that this change in diversity is having. So transgender male, slightly more, and increasing, which is encouraging. And I'm just so excited about this. This is What's funny to me about this slide is that they kind of slipped it in there, and it was almost like they weren't super like they weren't super trying to say this is a super important slide, but to me this stood out as like the most important slide. So, and then of course we have the increasing number of non-binary identifying people being employed by distilleries, and that's also increasing the most. So I just thought this was a super awesome slide that really shows the increase in diversity in the industry. And uh, as a person who identifies as a straight cis male, I have basically nothing to add to the pride conversation except data. So this is my contribution.
I mean, it's one of those. This is sort of an interesting topic from the point of view of there are going to be people who don't understand the significance of this, and what it is the broader the profile of people that you have working for you, the broader the profile of ideas that are available to you, particularly if you are doing a good job of listening to and engaging with your employees. They will have perspectives and ideas that you will not consider. And a lot of it does come to the table of advertising. Just a few years ago, I had an interesting conversation with someone about the way whiskey was almost exclusively advertised to people who look like me. And sort of very little attention was paid to consumers that fell outside of that profile. For example, my older sibling is the person who got me into good whiskey, and they're a non-binary individual. Um, One of the people that I drink with regularly, who is a whiskey enthusiast, is a woman. Some of my distilling heroes are women. Becky Harris, Caitlin Bartlemay, and sort of if the only people on your team are, cis straight white dudes, and that's who you're advertising to, you're missing women, you're missing non-binary individuals, and to a degree that you may not initially understand, that is also alienating to trans people, and in a way that you know this is what is expected of you if you are X, Y, or Z. And the broader the diversity in representation in advertising, and when you walk into a distillery and you communicate with the people who are there, that sets you up to sort of understand the environment of the distillery. And the broader the diversity in the company, the more welcoming you are to a broader audience. And I don't want to make it sound like this is a cynical advertising push, because this is coming from people who care deeply about the products that they are producing, that care a lot about you know making sure that the people who want to be involved in the industry are comfortable being involved in the industry, are comfortable coming to work, and are comfortable sharing their passion for the craft with other people. And I think that's the most important part.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think there's another note here, right? When industries see this kind of growth and diversity, it usually indicates that the industry is doing something to bring people into the fold. So we've talked about this bottle, this organization, quite a lot. It seems to come up for us a lot. It's really important to us. It means a lot to us. So this bottle, Good Deeds Malt Whiskey, which is not in my list of 7 bottles today. It didn't cleanly fit into a category. This is a blend of American single malt whiskeys, and this was made as a product to I don't know if it says on the bottle. The Step Up Foundation is a wow. I'm totally flubbing this delivery here. So Good Deed Spirits is associated with the Step Up Foundation, right? This is sort of the flagship product that is it's sort of, if you buy this, you're contributing to charity, right? All proceeds go to the Step Up Foundation. So what's the Step Up Foundation? So Step Up Foundation is, um, unfortunately, I put my notes away on that one when I restarted my computer earlier. So technical
Oops.
difficulties keep giving, but I think
Um,
I can wing this.
yeah.
So it's an organization that is dedicated to improving diversity in the industry through elevating underrepresented groups of people through a training and internship process that ultimately places them at distilleries where they'll be well equipped to do the job. So we're hoping to maybe get an interview with someone who's gone through the Step Up Foundation soon, but until we actually have a positive yes on that, I'm not going to identify that person. But that's going to be a lot of fun. I really want to know more about the inside workings of this from the perspective of someone who's gone through it. I think that would make for a fun interview as well.
Absolutely. And as someone who is queer, hi, I'm Philip. I'm queer, and I drink whiskey, and I experienced a lot of sort of, mostly not from people in the industry, but I experienced a lot of, like, in enthusiast circles, people who were not terribly welcoming to people who did not fit the mold of a straight white male, and you know the the diversity in the industry will translate to a more welcoming atmosphere in the enthusiast groups as well. And it is important to remember that whiskey isn't just a man's drink. It's for everybody who enjoys whiskey, regardless of what they look like or who they love.
On the note of the difference between men's whiskey and women's whiskey, which is really hard to nail down, as I've figured out. Our friend John Hughes with Embellish Podcast has been, I don't think he's released his episode on this yet, but he's been sort of compiling data about basically, he sent me a prompt and to a lot of people that was basically, if you have a female spouse who's not into whiskey, so it was couched in a particular, like this is a question about like what whiskeys appeal to women specifically. Now there's a broader conversation to have there, but this was the prompt. So basically, like have your wife go through your collection and pick out bottles that they think don't appeal specifically to men, or even better, do appeal specifically to women. And what I found is that even though I think I have a pretty good sense of my wife's sense of style and tastes, I did not accurately predict what bottles she would like. The only way you're going to get that information is by having people who have those perspectives on your marketing team. You're not going to be able to guess your way through to figure out what is going to appeal to a given demographic from a marketing perspective, right? If you want to build products for a demographic, you need that demographic to be involved in making those products, plain and simple. Also, I'm really looking forward to that episode from John. And
Yep.
that's, one of the reasons he is a good friend of this podcast is he shares a lot of the ideals that we have. And so he's also one of our nominations for doing this 7 bottles challenge next. So anything
Shall
else
we?
to add, or should we
I
proceed?
I think I've said my piece. I think we should pivot and use that as a segue to talk about the next segment.
Yep. All right. Let me bring that slide back up. All right. So Jerm from Freedom Malts challenged us to do this 7 most interesting bottles challenge. And when he first said that to me, I thought it was going to be go through your entire collection and pick out 7 of the most interesting things. And that was actually super hard. And then I realized when I watched his video that came out a few days later, this was actually broken down by category. So the way that these 7 most interesting bottles in our collection that we own, that we can show you, stuff over here on my desk, right? As opposed to samples or things that we've tried before or things that we know about, right? Things we actually own. Starting with a Scotch, then a rye, then a bourbon, then a wheat whiskey or a wheated whiskey, wheated bourbon, a finished whiskey, an American single malt or world single malt, and a unicorn or limited bottle. So start thinking about, get those wheels turning, think about what your things are that might fit into all these categories. And I'll come back to this in a moment, but the breakdown of these categories implies some rules, perhaps, or maybe rules that are meant to be broken. So that's going to be a
I
little bit of fun.
I broke all of them. I'm not good at following rules.
I broke a few, and I also have an entire list or two of backup
Yeah.
honorable mentions that we might talk about later, because we usually run for about 2 hours or at least an
Yeah.
hour and a half, and we'll probably end up talking about why we didn't include the things that we did.
Mhm.
So anyway, before we move on and actually talk about our bottles, I want to do, the next part of this challenge, which is pass it on, right? So I reached out to some people who I thought might be interested in doing this challenge, and the people who were keen on trying this, we have Jake from Coming Whiskey. If you don't know Coming Whiskey, he watches the TTB label submissions and posts about them, and also has a lot of great brand relationships. So he has a lot of really good insider information, and he has a pretty sizable collection of his own. So he doesn't do video content all that often, but when he does, it's usually full of information. So I'm looking forward to him. One of my favorite Instagram accounts is 2 Ounce Whiskey. Shri. He has a very good sense of humor, but it's not the kind of content where it's like making light of overconsumption, right? As a lot of humorous Instagram accounts are like, oh, I bought another bottle and I have to hide the credit card statement from my wife, or I went to the liquor store and blah blah blah, right? Like these things about like the culture around buying and waiting in line and over consuming. There's a lot of Instagram accounts like that. We're not huge fans of those accounts, but 2 Ounce Whiskey is one that is being quite humorous and doing it in a responsible way. So you should check him out if you're not already following him. And I'm looking forward to seeing what bottles he comes up with. I mentioned earlier John Hughes from Embellish Pod. We're big fans of that podcast, and we're looking forward to what he has to say, because we don't get to see his collection all that much. We know that he has one, but he doesn't talk about his own bottles all that much. So this should be a lot of fun. There's another account, similarly, an account that treats alcohol with the appropriate responsibility. He has a very similar sense about drinking as I do. So Joe from the Blind Pig Basement Pub. So that's the Instagram handle there. It's a little hard to read in this font. I apologize. So he was in an interview where he was talking about all the same things that I talk about all the time, right? Like even on a weekend, I'm not drinking to get drunk. I'm drinking to appreciate the liquid, right? He's got a pub in his basement, and he broadcasts, he does live streams. He talks about the bottles in his collection. He pretty much does everything that we do, and he does it with a responsible attitude. So we really like him there. Looking forward to seeing, I know he has a very different collection from me, so that's going to be really interesting. And I wanted to throw in a couple of honorable mentions. So there's 2 of us doing a list today. So that means if we were going to pass along 3 nominations each, we had 6 nominations to fill up. So Copperpot Brandy, I forgot his first name. I apologize. He is basically the Coming Whiskey of brandy labels. And in fact, they're friends. Since he doesn't have a collection that's full of whiskey, I sort of offered this to him and said, hey, like, this is an interesting idea, but I know that like you're going to want to talk more about brandy. So like take this idea of 7 most interesting bottles and kind of do what feels right with it. So that'll be really interesting to see. You should follow him if you're not. If you don't know that American brandy exists, this is where you're going to find out about it. There's a lot of really good stuff. And he covers European brandy as well. And then one more European, the Whiskey Amateur is a great Instagram account that does interviews and really good short form video content focused around Scotch and whiskey in the UK. So since he's in the UK and doesn't have access to that much American whiskey, I think it'd be interesting to see what he does with a 7 most interesting bottles, considering that he probably won't be able to fit into this set of categories that we're doing today. So he's game for that. We're going to see what he comes up with. So that's going to be a lot of fun. So without further ado, that's the most cross-pollination sort of promotion we've ever done on this show, which I'm all for it, right? The longer we've been in this space, the more we realize that this whole whiskey content creator thing, like, it's a community, right? Of people who are putting knowledge out into the world of their own perspectives and their own connections. So there's really a lot. There's a lot of value in the different perspectives that are out there. It doesn't really feel like we're competing with each other, right? I mean, like to a little bit, like there's only so much attention that people who might watch us can actually spend, but it really feels like it's more of a community. And this kind of video, like we're doing right now, is a way to feel even more like part of that community. So yeah. So Jerm's in the chat, also the Whiskey Shaman and Carrie Daniels. Thanks all for hanging out today. So Jerm says we need to support each other fully. I completely agree with that. You know, I could say I would like to put these things in less self-serving ways. So I could say, you know, we are trying to grow the pie, right? Of getting people interested in craft spirits and American single malt whiskey, right? That's certainly my mission, right? I want to do that education. I want to make American single malt whiskey a household name and have people understand what it is that they're drinking. That's a big important thing for me, and I can't do it alone. The only way that American single malt whiskey is going to get the traction is if other people like Jerm are also talking about it, right? If every one of these Instagram accounts talks more about American single malt and less about bourbon, then we're going to move the needle on American single malt becoming a household name. So that's a great way of doing it. Since I'm just monologuing, I should get rid of that slide and make our faces bigger. So in my personal life, one of my other hobbies is music. I play in a community orchestra. The community orchestras have this bad habit of assuming that the community orchestras are competing with each other. That is unfortunately the way that most of these things run. They just assume, right? We shouldn't be avoiding the concert time of that other orchestra that we're, you know, they have a different venue on the same day, doesn't matter. Our audience and their audience, we're competing for that audience. So in a sense, they're almost like it's almost better that we have the concert on the same day because we can see who goes. If you just think about that for half a second, you can see that that's really not going to help improve the number of people who are going to actually attend community orchestra concerts. In fact, we should be growing the pie, not competing for that small pie, right? That's the people interested in seeing community orchestra concerts is very small. And our competition is professional orchestras. And we should all be supporting each other as community groups, because a lot of community orchestras, you know, they do it for hobby, which means there's a lot of passion behind it. A lot of the people who do it chose not to do music as a career because music is an unforgiving career, but there's a lot of talent still, and they want somewhere to play. So community orchestras are where those people get to play. And you might be surprised if you go look for a community orchestra and you find that it's actually a pretty good orchestra and becomes one of your favorites. And we're talking like the difference between spending $100 on a concert ticket and $10 on a concert ticket for, you know, depending on your level of musical skill, pretty similar, you know, you might even get pretty similar experiences, right? Like as a musician, I can say the professional groups are for sure way better. But there are at least some professional groups that we can kind of compete with on skill level. So
I am spoiled for choice where I live, because I live near enough Washington, D.C. that all the, you know, President's own Marine Band, Pershing's own Army Band, the U.S. Air Force Airmen of Note, all the musicians who played for them retired to this area. So our community bands are stacked with some of the most talented, technically amateur musicians you will ever hear perform. And a lot of their concerts are practically free. Just saying.
Yeah. So that was a nice little tangent. But the point is that this whole whiskey podcasting, whiskey YouTubing thing, whiskey Instagram thing that we're doing, like there are people who aren't, you know, people who do the content creation who actually consume our content. And the more of the content that there is, the more options for perspectives and different types of voices, the better for everyone who doesn't already know. So, you know, this sort of challenge where we're nominating all these other people to get involved and share about their collections, I really think this is going to be a great way to just grow this pie, right? So since our mission on this podcast is to talk about American single malt whiskey, and that's not the majority of what we're doing today, at least ostensibly, I think once we get past our challenge list, Phil and I are going to try to put together a list of interesting American single malts to sort of balance the scales a little bit. Well, if time allows, we'll do that. And if time doesn't allow for it, I'm going to throw an extra nomination out there for Phil, who has his own YouTube channel. to do one of these lists, but focus it on Virginia whiskey, because aside from this category that says, oh, you've got to have or where's the view, right? Aside from Scotch, every one of these categories can
Is
be an
for
American whiskey, right?
yep.
So you could just say Scotch style, right?
Mhm.
Which is also a single malt, I guess. But right, you're going to find a way to do it. We're going to get
Yep.
a Virginia focused list that's going to play in really nicely to the Virginia whiskey tournament. So did we talk about the Virginia whiskey tournament yet?
Not yet. I figure we'll do this, and then I've got a segue.
All right, cool.
I mean,
Sounds good.
not the wheel thing, like a.
Why not? Those are so fun.
Yeah, I just when the creator went over a cliff on one, it kind of soured the idea of them for me. You know.
All right, and I'm
Sorry,
gonna
that was a little
throw
bit
this
dark.
out. I'm just gonna not touch that. I'm gonna just throw this out there. So Rich makes a very good point. Irish should be on this list. It's not. That wasn't the list that we were given for this challenge. I agree that Irish is a major. I mean, really, Irish and Scotch, like historically speaking, are hand in hand. And these days, nobody talks about Irish whiskey anymore, and they should, because Irish whiskey is coming back. So
Here's my Irish pick.
yeah, let's open up with Irish, so we can at least satisfy Rich on that question.
Yeah. This is the Waterford Peated Ballybennin. It is like no other peated whiskey I've ever had. It is like fresh, fertilized mulch, and like if you've ever like encountered a mulch fire. By the way, mulch piles will spontaneously combust if you leave them in the sun, and it is like because fertilizer is to some extent animal dung, and it has a little bit of that like that rich like sort of barnyard funk, burning mulch and vegetal notes, on all layered on top of that very nice classic Irish whiskey core. That's why this is my pick for the Irish whiskey.
So I really wish that I actually owned a bottle of Cologne right now, because that would definitely take the cake.
Oh yeah.
But I since I don't actually own a bottle of Cologne, my answer is going to be pretty boring, I think, to this question. So interesting Irish whiskeys. I feel like I'm inclined to just like go with the best Irish whiskey bottles that I have, or like one of them. I really don't have very many. It's actually a shame. So I found the tube, but I can't find the bottle. Oh, there it is. So I really like Yellow Spot. I think that this scratches the same itches as a really good Speyside malt does, and it has a little bit different flavor profile because it's a Irish single pot still whiskey. And what makes this one more interesting to me than the Green Spot, for instance, which I have both, or even the Redbreast, the various Redbreasts, is that this actually makes a point of noting what casks it's aged in, and it has an interesting cask I've never seen anywhere else. So bourbon barrels, sherry butts, and Malaga casks. I don't even know what Malaga is.
Huh.
So that's a gap in my knowledge for sure, but I literally have never seen that on any other product. So that makes this one stand out to me as particularly interesting. And you can see that's a fair bit of consumption for me, right? Considering that I got this one back in November, I think. This was a birthday gift. So that'll be my pick for most interesting Irish that I own. And also, I guess I didn't understand the assignment because I watched. I'm realizing now because of Jerm's comment. It could have been 2, 5, 6, 7. Could have been anything. So Jerm picked this list, and I just echoed it.
Yeah.
because he said 7 most interesting whiskeys, and I thought that there was more to that, so I watched his video to find out what it was. And then I just said, let's do the same thing. So, okay, good to know that we can just add other things in. So there's our pick for Irishes. I wish that I had more to choose from. So now moving on to the next in the list. So Scotch. Phil, I think you have a really interesting one for this. Do you want to start?
Yeah. So mine is really interesting because this was a gift to me from my friend Ashton about 6 years ago now. It had been malingering in the back of a kitchen cabinet for a long time, and because neither of his parents really drink and he doesn't do whiskey very much, he gave it to me. And it was a mystery because I couldn't find anything about Peter Scotch whiskey. There's Peter Scotch, Peter Scott, which is an Indian whiskey made by a Scottish man in India. But nothing about that. And I ended up looking. I ended up looking up Scottish Independent Distillers Company Limited in Company's House, which is a UK government agency that does all of the, maintains records for company registrations and whatnot, to figure out what that company became and who I could email to ask questions. And it was relatively innocuous, released initially in like 2005, I want to say. My memories on it is a little bit hazy, but it's not, probably wouldn't be special to anyone else, but my friend Ashton gave it to me, and it's sort of special to me, and also sort of an interesting mystery to solve, which was a lot of fun.
I just had this weird feeling that I forgot something.
Oh, I have that all the time.
Never mind. Yeah, let's take a step back, because we do a live show, which means that we get good feedback from the audience sometimes. So Rich says his favorite Irish is the Method and Madness Japanese cedarwood.
Interesting.
Very interesting.
I want to try some of that stuff.
Yeah, Japanese cedarwood. Yeah, that definitely sounds like something awesome to try. Everybody, when it comes to Japanese wood, everybody talks about Mizunara. And I almost picked a Mizunara cask whiskey, but I honestly don't think it's that interesting, right? Like, Mizunara is everywhere now. A couple of years ago, it would have been interesting. But anyway, my pick for, and also I have far more interesting Scotch in my collection anyway. So my pick for my most interesting Scotch is this Rest and Be Thankful, which is an independent bottler of mostly Bruichladdich products, or maybe entirely. So this is a Port Charlotte that is aged for 13 years and aged exclusively in ex-bourbon casks, which, if you know anything about Bruichladdich, most of the magic of the brand is their awesome blending program. They have a whole bunch of different wine casks, and they blend it together to a great profile. And there's something that people tend to refer to as the Bruichladdich magic, right? Or the wine casks magic, or something like that. And you don't often get this opportunity to try a raw, unmodified Bruichladdich distillate in this way. So this was the first bottle I ever bought that cost me over $300 after shipping and taxes. I did buy this directly from, I think, an auction. It came from Europe. And I haven't opened it in a minute, so I'm going to tip it so the cork doesn't get stuck. That's my new tip, right? Everybody talks about turning your bottles, and what I found is that if you are about to open a bottle, you turn it, you wait for about 5 to 10 seconds, and then you open the cork. Then you don't get the cork sticking and breaking on you in the bottle, and it saves having to go around to your collection and tip your bottles every 3 months or whatever from some random reason, and then face that whole if you tip your bottles too often, alcohol is actually dehydrating, so you end up dehydrating the cork, which is the opposite of what you wanted. There's one reason I don't turn my bottles all that often. But this trick works for me, where you turn it just when you're going to open it, and that usually is enough. I've never had a cork break on me since I started doing that, which is maybe it's only just a matter of time. But such is life. So this one, I would say, for the amount that I spent on it, I was hoping it would be my favorite bottle in my collection. By what's an awkward statement, Rich? Which thing did I say was awkward? There's a whole lot of awkward statements.
I think every time I open my mouth.
Jerm agrees. Tip it just before opening. Yeah, Rich says it's an awkward statement. Rich says his favorite scotch would be the Balvenie 21 Portwood. I have a bottle, and I'm saving it until my hypothetical child, is 21 years old. So it's going to be sitting around for a long time. And that's why I need to know, how do I take care of a sealed bottle so that it doesn't just go to crap while sitting on the shelf for 25 years?
Oh, I wouldn't say that your statement about your Scotch pick is awkward. Just saying. I mean,
yeah,
it's a valid choice.
So I commented before we started streaming, if this was going to be the first thing that I tasted, this would be rough, because this is 62.2% alcohol, and it's not a warm and fuzzy kind of drink. So I think I might just nose it for now, save it for later, have a couple of sips. So I was expecting this, for the price. I was hoping, at least, that this would be the favorite bottle in the collection. Port Charlotte at the time was my favorite whiskey total. Like, overall, even Octomore, it's like peatier is not better in my case. So the Port Charlotte just sort of threads that needle for me. And there's something about the Port Charlotte level of peat and the way that they use the wine casks that's really nice to me. Now I know that I was signing up for non-wine cask Bruichladdich Port Charlotte here, so I didn't quite know what to expect. But this ends up being, it's good, don't get me wrong, but it's not the best Port Charlotte that I have. And it is more interesting for being this academic curiosity of, you like Port Charlotte, you like Octomore, have you ever tasted it just in plain ex-bourbon? So that's what you get when you try this whiskey. And yeah, I'm definitely going to leave that for later because that's fiery right now. Let it open up a little bit.
Let's see.
This, of course, because this is my Thanksgiving whiskey, right? Because rest and be thankful. It's too on the nose.
Just making sure I'm keeping on top of audience comments. I have never had anything from Ardent American. They are a relatively new distillery, I believe. I'd love to try some stuff from them, but Oloroso and single malt go together very well.
So I have a fun story about Ardent American, actually. It is a relatively new distillery, and they do sell casks to, before filling, even, as it turns out, to private parties. And so I'm a member of the Malt Runners Review website. And the group of people that made that website decided that we wanted to buy, it's people on that website, reviewers on that website, plus a few friends, decided, I think 13 of us went splitsies on buying a cask of Ardent American. And we got to decide what went into it. So it's peated distillate in an Oloroso cask for its entire life.
Ooh.
And we're expecting to pull that cask by the time it's around 7 years old. And it's been a year so far. Not quite. When do they fill it? December, actually. It hasn't even been close to a year. Yeah. So stay tuned for the next 7 years to find out if we're still doing this show, or you'll probably always be able to find me in the Whiskey Lodge. I will let you know how it tastes. I think our expected yield, so we're probably going to get 200 plus bottles of it split 13 ways. So I'm going to have a lot of whiskey. What is that? 30 bottles? No.
I'm not sure.
20-ish bottles? But it's hard to tell, right? Anyway, so that'll be fun. Ardent American is really nice. I got to try them with the Impex portfolio back at a tasting event at some point, which included the single cask nation stuff and included What's the distillery, the new one that John Campbell's at after he left Laphroaig? Lochlee.
Oh.
Lochlee.
Yeah.
Jerm, good question. I don't know if I personally will, but we formed a trust. Actually, we called it the Association of Wax Enthusiast Cask Trust. All of us are executors of the trust, so any one of us can go and taste the barrel periodically. I don't know if we all can, but the chances that I'm going to go to Scotland once a year to taste my barrel are pretty slim. So most likely, the couple of our group that are in the UK are going to be the ones that are tasting it and letting us know how it's going.
Shall we move along to rye?
Yeah, and Sam says he has one of the
Ooh.
inaugural peated Oloroso casks, so you'll love that if the cask variants doesn't eat it. Yeah, casks are a funny thing, aren't they? Here's a moment for me to talk. It's a soapbox a little about cask investment schemes, right? This is not a cask investment scheme. What we did here was very intentionally buy a cask of whiskey so that we could own all of the bottles, right? The same way that an independent bottler would buy a cask of whiskey. It just so happens that Ardnamurchan made this readily available to the public if you were interested. Now, one person going up there and buying effectively 200 bottles of whiskey 8 years from now is kind of a weird thing. So the only way this makes any sense for even a serious whiskey enthusiast is to go in with a group of friends. We are absolutely not going. The part of our trust agreement is nobody is going to be selling these bottles, right? These are for our private collections. That's very important for us for people to know that, this is not meant to be a bottle flip barrel investment scheme. And if it turns out that the barrel goes bone dry, not in the sherry sense, but in the there's no liquid in it sense, shit happens. We're collectively out a few $1,000s. So, and that's one of the reasons that your cask investment schemes can go sideways. We're just willing to take that risk. So anyway, let's move on and actually do the prompt.
Yes.
So next up is rye, Phil's favorite category.
I broke the rules, kind of.
Well, okay. Say what your bottle is and then tell me why you think you broke the rules.
I picked the Catoctin Creek Pearson's Wine and Liquor Barrel Select, finished in a Laphroaig cask.
That is indeed interesting.
And it is a finished rye whiskey, which perhaps doesn't really fit the rules, but it is, without a doubt, one of the most interesting rye whiskeys I own a bottle of, and that I have ever tried at all. It is amazing. This is the bottle that prompted me to, I think I direct messaged the master distiller of Hood River Distillers at the time, Joe O'Sullivan, to be like, hey, theoretically speaking, if I bought a barrel and sent it to you to be filled with peated malt, and then, once it was done, brought it back to Virginia to be filled with rye, how many hoops would I have to jump through? Because I want a bottle of Catoctin Creek that was finished in a barrel that held McCarthy's. Because I love Catoctin Creek. I have 17 bottles of Catoctin Creek whiskey. And I love McCarthy's, which is produced at Clear Creek, now under the supervision of Master Distiller Caitlin Bartlemy. And I think that I should bring them together somehow.
So this wasn't a thing we talked about live, I think, but it was in the Whiskey Lodge at least.
Yeah.
I
keep threatening to drive to Oregon with a fresh rye barrel.
Right, because what did I do? I put McCarthy's in a rye cask.
Yeah.
Or something along those lines. Or
yeah. Yeah.
I can't remember exactly what I did, but basically I was like, hey, if you don't think this is going to work, I'll prove it to you, right? Because I want this to happen too. Um, so the interesting thing is that later on, I think you made a post on Twitter
Mhm,
where both of them essentially agreed that it was a good idea. And
mhm.
then we're like, okay, so everyone's into this. Now we just need to get we need to get you two parties actually talking, right?
Yeah. I mean, this is what sparked the, like, holy cow, that'd be awesome. And someday I'll do it. Someday I'm going to spend $120 on a empty rye whiskey barrel and transport it to Hood River somehow.
Yeah,
Just
that
drop
I
it off
think you can
on the
do
loading
without
dock.
permits, but once
Oh,
it's actually filled
absolutely.
with whiskey, then it becomes then you need to have a bonded truck, right? I don't even know
Yeah.
if that's a thing, but like yeah, you need to keep it in bond, which means that you need to have permits and probably brand relationships.
Well, I don't want to move it while it's full. That's a lot of weight. But
Oh, right, I see. I understand. What you were saying never involves transporting liquid across the country.
mhm, I just want to take the empty barrel to Hood River, leave it in their care for a while, and then after it's emptied, buy a couple of bottles,
Mhm.
and then take that barrel back to Catoctin Creek and leave it on their loading dock.
Yep. Speaking of McCarthy's and interesting barrels, so McCarthy's didn't make this particular list, but it's definitely going to make the American single malt list. So stay tuned. But
Oh
as
yeah,
long as we're talking about McCarthy's and
yes.
buying bottles of things that have been left in their care for a while, I still can't give details because contracts haven't been signed. But one of the things I've been doing a lot of back end on recently is we have an ever more real barrel pick of McCarthy single malt in an interesting cask. And it would be a great theme to fit into this video if only I could say what it was. But it's going to be good, and it's going to be coming in about 6 to 8 weeks. And it will be available for purchase on the Hood River Distillers online website, which will be fulfilling through Big Thirst and will be deliverable to 40-ish states, give or take, I think. So yeah, be ready.
That would have been on the list if I could talk about it.
We don't own the bottles yet either, unfortunately.
I know.
Well, I have a pint sample. Does that count? But I can't
I
show it because, well, if we could show it anyway.
Yeah.
All right.
Your rye
So
pick.
I really struggled over the rye pick because oh yeah, you were gonna say why you felt you broke the rules.
Oh, because it I I was because finished is already a category on the list that we
Yes.
had, and this is a finished whiskey. So I was thinking, kind of, but my alternative was also Catoctin Creek, just an unfinished cask strength clear Catoctin Creek. Sorry, my brain is scrambled because I'm still thinking about
Clear Catoctin Carthy's.
yeah. yeah.
Right. So
I will make it
you felt
happen
you were
one day.
breaking the rules because you picked a finished whiskey, which makes it technically not a rye. Is that what you're saying?
Well, it is. I think that there's sort of a gray area there. But I was more of thinking like because finished is already a category on the list. So I didn't want to dip too heavily into finished whiskeys. Although, for the record, I could fill this list just with finished whiskeys.
And you could fill this list with just ryes, even the single
Yes.
malts.
Yes. Technically speaking.
If you count a malted rye as a single malt,
Mhm.
but according to American single malt rules, that's not included. And I know that there are people who are mad about that. So
Yeah. I mean, it's a different grain.
moving on. Yes, it
You're
is.
right.
It is a different grain, right? But it's malted barley versus malted rye. It just
Yeah.
happens that historically, malt without a qualifier refers to malted barley. So
Mhm.
that's the reason for that. It's. I understand the people who say that's dumb, but also from a marketing perspective, the ability to sell an American single malt in Scotland as a single malt and not have to not have to bend any rules or
Yeah.
beg. Like the same products get also shipped to Europe and sold in Europe. Single malt should mean the same thing. So that's a
Hmm.
very good reason, right? We forget about the rest of the world sometimes here in America.
But by the way,
Nice.
I
You
poured
talked to
my
Greek Glencairn?
yes. Seemed appropriate.
Oh yeah. I had some thought behind appropriateness when I pulled out my glasses and then just promptly used whatever. All
Yeah.
right. So on that note of I actually was trying not to pick a finished rye. Because I was going to pick a finished bourbon for my bourbon category and I didn't want to bend that rule too far. So I will say, just as an honorable mention, the most interesting cask I have for a rye is an Armagnac cask. Oh wait, no. That's I'm thinking of. I didn't pull it out, did I? Oh, there it is. It's a Starlight, but the Armagnac is a bourbon. The rye is a VDN barrel finish, right?
Ah.
I didn't want to pick this one for my rye pick, so here's my honorable mention for rye. VDN in this case is Vino de Naranja rather than Vindu Natural. So it's not a sweet natural wine. It's an orange wine. And that gives a really interesting character to this rye. So this was my favorite rye for a while because everything I had was either MGP or this. And the finish added a whole lot for me. But I didn't want to do a finished rye for my rye pick. I have another runner-up that I could talk about. Should I talk about the other runner-up first? Just because it's a
why
cool
not?
model. So here's a fun historical note. This is one of the first releases of Woodinville whiskey.
Oh,
It's got a
that's
different
cool.
bottle entirely. This is
Mhm.
from, it doesn't say the date that it was filled, but I think it was 2014 or something like that. I got this from a friend who was downsizing his collection. And I actually got it about this full, right? He was just like, yeah, I have to get rid of some bottles. Do you want this? And I was like, that's a really cool thing to have on my shelf. To be quite honest, it doesn't taste great. I have had much better ryes, even from Woodinville whiskey. They've come a long way, but it's really cool that I have this little piece of history here. So that makes it interesting. But in making this list, I was struggling between what is an interesting bottle to talk about versus what is a really good tasting or interesting tasting whiskey. So in this case, it's an interesting bottle to talk about, but it only gets honorable mention because I don't particularly like it.
Yeah. I mean, that's fair.
So my winner for this category is a bottle that I just opened last night, actually, and this saved
Ooh.
me. I'm glad that I got to put this in there. So this is a Lost Lantern. This is a very limited release from a 15-gallon cask, Kings County Distillery, New York straight rye whiskey. And I have to check and keep rechecking. So this is 5 years old in a 15-gallon New American Oak barrel, right? So New American Oak, small barrel, 5 years old. This is an old small barrel. And it also, so it's 80% rye, 20% malted barley. No finishing cask. This is a straight rye whiskey in every sense of the word. Now, what it tastes like, I could swear that this was aged or finished in a nice tawny port cask or something along those lines. It is just so richly, beautifully fruity. I don't really have that much rye in my collection. I've always been interested in it. But because rye is very similar, at least the ryes that I experienced early on, very similar in terms of flavor profile and variability compared to bourbon, I sort of said I don't like bourbon all that much as a category with a lot of variety. And so I'm kind of not really going to pay that much attention to rye either. So rye is a category where I buy strictly on recommendation at this point from people who drink rye. So when Phil recommends me something, when Adam from Lost Lantern recommends me something, when Jerm recommends me something that's a rye, those are things I'm likely to go buy. But I'm not likely to walk into a store and grab a random rye because my experience with that is, me personally, for my palate, doesn't usually work that well. I think that happens to a lot of people because so many ryes are MGP 95.5. If you don't like that, a whole lot of rye is going to taste like that. So very glad that this arrived in the mail earlier this week and I opened it yesterday, because this far and away is the most interesting and most delicious rye that I have. I expected this to be an oak bomb in a way that I wouldn't like, and I just kind of love it to death. And I almost wish that I had bought 2 of these bottles, but they're very limited. So I'm happy that I left. I'm also happy that I left some for other people. So
And then, as always, highlighting some of the comments from the pawn. Rye would be glacial distilling bad rock for him, which I've never heard of.
crazy. This crazy. Actually, so this might end up on the American single malt list for interesting. Reminds me actually a lot of this, but way better. Like the rye is way better. Like, I'm just going to put that out there right now, but this is a super interesting bottle. We'll talk about this later. All right, next up, I've lost track of where we are.
Bourbon.
Next up is bourbon. Do you want to go first, or should we switch?
Yeah.
Should I do a bourbon first?
I already have the bottle in my hand, so
Okay, go ahead. Old Forester. Is that birthday bourbon? Nice.
This is the birthday bourbon. So this is not my favorite bourbon. In fact, it's pretty far from my favorite, but it is one of the most interesting. It is 12 years old. It's Old Forester, and I like the Old Forester 100 proof bourbon, like the standard. You go in and grab it off the shelf, and I expected to like this stuff. This almost tastes like a Texas bourbon for how much just pure bitter oak tannin there is just packed in every sip of this. It is so mouth drying and almost chewy from the oak taste.
So help me out here, because I haven't had that much Old Forester. I think I've had I've had Old Forester 1920. I actually love that. How does this compare there?
So I haven't had the 1920. I have the 1910, which is the closest I have in terms of flavor profile.
That one's the bottled in bond, right?
No, this is the 1897 is the bottled in bond. It's the year of the Bottled in Bond Act. This is the sort of commemorates the year of the fire on Whiskey Row, and this is double barreled because I had to rebarrel a bunch of the bourbon due to cask damage. But it is sort of the classic, nice, round, comfortable, friendly Old Forester flavor that is fairly corn heavy, so it's fairly soft and round and kind of shiny, but with like just oak upon oak upon oak. And the birthday bourbon takes this up a good notch or two. It is pretty potently oaky.
So the only time I've had birthday bourbon, it was actually at an event where a collector basically brings out all of his bottles, and tickets to the event benefit a local wildlife charity, which is an awesome event, because this guy basically just takes a chance on anything at auction, and some of them are good and some of them are not, but either way, you're going to get to taste them. So the birthday bourbon I think I got was from like the 90s that I got to try, which was pretty cool, or possibly maybe early 2000s, but it was like at least 15 to 20 years old. And I don't mean age of liquid, I mean the bottling, right?
Mm-hmm.
Distinction for anyone who, I know we have some newbies who watch regularly. So once whiskey goes into a bottle, it doesn't get any older in the sense of the liquid becoming more mature. but your bottle can sit on the shelf for decades, right? So, if it goes in the bottle, it's 5 years old, it stays 5 years old for the next 100 years, or, and
Mhm.
beyond, right? Until it's dust, right? It'll always be a 5-year-old whiskey unless you're aging in wood. That's just how whiskey works. So, in this case, though, I don't know how old Birthday Bourbon is, but it reminded me of the Rip Van Winkle or Pappy 15 or whatever it was that I got to
Mhm.
try, but like in like I didn't particularly like that. Too oaky for me. 15-year-old Buffalo Trace turns out not my flavor palette. Doesn't work for me. It reminded me of that in a bad way.
I like that. I like that a lot.
It stops having birthdays when it comes out of the barrel. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jerm. Okay. Bourbon.
Yes.
So here's where I bent the rule. For me, bourbon is very similar, kind of across the board. And I also one of the reasons that Woodinville Rye actually was my runner-up is because I didn't want to feature the same brand twice for being interesting. And again,
Mhm.
right, I give good reasons for it being runner-up. So Woodinville whiskey was my interesting bourbon of choice, and I had two possible options here. The one I would have liked to pick was the Ginja cask, but I don't own that bottle. I split it I joined in a split with a friend, so I got a third of a bottle. So I don't have the original bottle of that one, but that's very cool. It's a wood that you've never experienced before. Basically, it's just got an interesting cinnamony profile. It's not Amberana. It's Ginjinha or something pronounced like that. I'm sure I'm butchering it, but the Woodinville label called it Ginja cask. So that would have been my first pick if I had the whole bottle of it. And while that's really interesting, and here's another reason why that would have been a runner-up. While it's really interesting, I don't like it that much. It's very powerful in a weird way. It doesn't
Mhm.
totally feel like whiskey, right? It's a very strong wood flavor that isn't oak, so it really changes that profile. Now, what I did pick is my Woodinville Muscatel finished bourbon. And as we learned a couple of weeks ago in our sherry episode, Muscatel is like PX, but it's a different grape. So it's another kind of sherry. And so bourbon tastes kind of samey. There's not a whole lot of variation in the flavor profile for bourbon. Usually you get your brown sugar and your toffee and your caramel and your cherry and your oak and cinnamon, maybe a couple of other spices might come in. So for me, bourbon can be really good, but is rarely very interesting unless it's finished bourbon, right? So that's why I picked a finished bourbon here. This is, and technically finished whiskey becomes a distilled specialty spirit product.
Mhm.
But for all intents and purposes, everybody thinks of this as bourbon. It's bourbon with a finish, right? And so this happens to be my favorite bourbon, and it's also really, really interesting in flavor profile. It adds like a candied. I'm gonna test my memory on this one. Actually, it adds like a candied what do you call it? Like a praline, like a walnut praline with like a hint of peanut.
Yeah.
Just really, really good stuff here. I'm gonna let that air out for a minute while I show off the other cool thing about this bottle. So I bought two. I went to the release event. I bought one to have signed by the distillers. So this is the Woodinville Muscatel finished with signatures from Orlin, I think, and I can't remember the other one's name. Brad, I want to say. Either way, really cool. I got this like 2 or 3 years ago, so this has been sitting around for a while. I've been nursing it because I really love it, and I also don't spend that long thinking about bourbon anymore.
I mean, that's fair.
One of my usual complaints about Woodinville whiskey is very good, but it also is very sharp. It tends to drink hotter than it is, right? The 45 percenters taste like they're 55. Like they're angry, right? Something about the sweet wine finish on this one really just tamped that way down. So even though this is 100 proof, it should be stronger, hotter. It actually is much more mellow, full of flavor. Yeah, good stuff. I stand by this choice after retasting it.
All right, and following along at home, the Pawn has offered Grand Teton private stock as his pick for bourbon. I've heard of Grand Teton. I have never had anything from them.
I just realized, so I just did that little monologue about how bourbon doesn't have a lot of flavor variation. I know Rich agrees with me. I think that some of the people who are listening don't necessarily agree with me, and that's fine. My own personal experience with bourbon and what I've actually gotten to taste is definitely biasing that opinion. What I will say is there's this bottle behind me, 1792 single barrel pick. Yeah, there it is. From the Barrel Thief, which is an awesome local whiskey bar, mostly focused on Scotch. 1792 usually tastes like cherry cola. I got that from our friend. That tasting note, I think I got from our friend Xeno Razor or Whiskey Ramble, as he goes by. That was another honorable mention. So he, at the last minute, told me that he was actually interested in doing this, but probably not as a video because he doesn't really do video content. But we'll see.
Yeah.
So usually 1792 tastes like cherry cola. This one tastes like dill.
Interesting.
Just straight up dill. And I bought it because that was the most interesting bourbon I had ever tasted to that point, and it's not finished. So that's my honorable mention, and one of the reasons it's my honorable mention is because I love the Woodinville so much, and also I haven't opened that bottle yet.
I mean,
so.
I'm in the process of buying as many Virginia whiskeys as I can, and I was originally going to buy a bourbon from Springfield Distillery and ended up instead getting this because bourbon's got like a 20% variation in flavors, and this is bourbon mash aged for its entire life in port casks, which means that it's not bourbon, but that makes it a lot more interesting to me.
Okay, so bourbon mash, but not bourbon. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, it's a change of subject, but
somehow I've lost track of what I poured. Just like where did the bottle go? For the other one?
The Muscatel.
Oh, okay. I put the Rest and Be Thankful on the floor. That's why. I was like, I've somehow lost my count.
Do we want to talk about wheated or wheat whiskey now?
Yeah, whiskey distilled from a bourbon mash. Yep.
Yes.
At least 51% corn, but not new oak. So yeah, fun stuff.
Yeah.
Samalo says 1792 dill would be so unique. Wow. And I'll clarify again for anybody who's new to tasting whiskey. When I say it tastes like just dill, I don't mean like literally it's like dill juice, right? Like all of these tasting notes are taken in the context of, yes, it's still bourbon, but the one tasting note that really stands out from that one is dill. So also like maybe a little bit of fennel, but since I didn't open it to retaste it and make sure, but still that's unusual for that brand.
Mm-hmm.
Usually 1792 is very sweet. Brulee brown sugar, cherry cola, like your typical very sweet bourbon style notes.
Yeah.
So having it go so herbal was a really interesting surprise. Yeah, let's move on. So next up is wheated whiskey.
So I had three options that immediately stood out to me. I have a bottle of the Burnham Original 7-year-old wheat whiskey, which is very good. Initially, I really did not like it, but it opened up to be something a lot more interesting. And I've got a little 50 milliliter bottle that no longer has 50 milliliters of whiskey in it of the Ragged Branch wheated bourbon, which is, my personal opinion, one of the best bourbons being made in Virginia at the moment. But what I decided to go with is the bare knuckle straight wheat whiskey, aged 49 months. They don't have a lot of distribution outside of Virginia, and I think it's a real shame. They're produced in Manassas, Virginia. They every bottle like this that's produced has the age statement handwritten into the little round card on the back.
Nice. Yeah. That's at 49 months, by the way, for anyone who
Yes.
didn't catch that.
And that is the oldest that I have seen. They range from between about 30-ish to about 40-ish usually. And they punch way above their weight class. I mean, if you look at how much is missing from this, knowing that I don't drink very much very often, that should tell you how much I like this stuff.
I'm just laughing because this is like the teetotalers channel. Like, we make fun of Skip for not drinking. Skip is one of the mods in the Whiskey Lodge. Go check out the Whiskey Lodge, by the way. Link in the description.
Yeah.
That's where we hang out and talk about anything that is whiskey or otherwise. We value moderation so much that we have excuse the pun. We have a moderator who is the pinnacle of moderation. He basically stopped drinking shortly after we made him a mod. He was just like, yeah, I'm done with whiskey. He's like, do you still want to be a mod? Yeah, sure.
Yeah. He's also, strangely, for being the driest of our moderators, the most trouble.
Oh, he's rambunctious.
But yeah, enjoy my little Virginia Spirits Expo drink local bourbon glass with this stuff in it. It's just like rich dark chocolate, cherry cordials, like the little cordial cherry chocolates, and just a hint of like fresh quarter sawn oak.
All right, so
Fantastic stuff.
I like that Rich is giving us his selections because he's going to have to sign off.
Mhm.
We're going to read those, but first, because I have some homework to do, my pick for wheated bourbon is the Garrison Brothers Cowboy Bourbon. And I'm just going to put that out there, and I'll talk about why I think this is so interesting, but I have to open it.
Okay.
And also, gold medal. So while I open this, Phil, read Richard's selections for the rest of our list.
All right. So, the pawn or Rich's pick for a finished whiskey is the Killowen Cask KD202 in Tawny Port. Killowen, by the way, is I believe his favorite distillery in the world. Next up is his American single malt whiskey pick is Stoneholm Highland Laddie Celtic Whiskey, which is an American single malt produced at obviously Stoneholm. And it draws heavily in its influence from Scottish and, as I understand it, some Irish distilling heritage and history. It is on my list. It's in Montana. Next up, his unicorn, as surprises no one, Redbreast 27, which is a heck of a unicorn.
Yeah, and to clarify, that's not just one thing he wants. He owns it. He has the Redbreast 27.
Yeah. Which, hats off. That is an excellent find to begin with, because I think there were a grand total of 3 bottles that made it to the Commonwealth of Virginia. So, if I were wearing a hat, I'd take my hat off to you.
You could take off the headphones, but then you wouldn't be able to hear me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've actually gotten to taste the Redbreast 27, and for me, it is one of the. It's not just a unicorn. It's also super interesting. It's super dry. You wouldn't expect. At least that was my experience with it. Maybe batches vary. But it tasted like, you know, that dry flat bread that you get at Indian restaurants sometimes, the
Mhm.
papadums? It tasted like that with just a tiny bit more sweetness to it, but really quite dry, like chickpea and fennel and that kind of thing, especially next to other whiskeys that are typically more sweet. And it was really, really good. And if it wasn't what, $900, I would consider buying a bottle. All right, so the Garrison Brothers Cowboy Bourbon. This was the 2023 batch, I believe. Oh, actually 2021. So I have a very old edition of this. This was given to me as a housewarming gift by my dad. So one of the reasons that this makes my most interesting whiskeys is because this is the, what do you say, the most the most premium, the pinnacle of
Mhm.
this brand, which is my dad's favorite brand. Dad loves Lafroig 10 cask strength and Garrison Brothers, big punchy flavors, right? All over the place. So in honor of Father's Day coming up, I felt it was only appropriate to finally open this bottle that Dad would have liked me to open a long time ago, I think. Or at least my own sensibilities would have had me opening this a long time ago. But another reason that this is, so this is one place where I actually thought ahead. So why did I bring out the American Craft Spirits Association glass for this whiskey? I think you know the answer to this.
Actually, I don't.
Oh, okay.
Just like,
So Garrison Brothers Cowboy Bourbon 2023 won Best in Show at ACSA.
ah, okay. I remember that now, but I was racking my brain to find another connection.
So that's why the ACSA glass. And one thing that makes this interesting to me, I don't have a lot of wheated bourbons to choose from, right? I have samples of the odd wheated bourbon. I have Buffalo Trace standard. You know, maybe one or two others, but like wheated bourbon is kind of hard to find. Oh, Maker's Mark, of course. Actually, I did strongly consider picking one of my Maker's Mark 46s or like the cask finishing series, but like
Mhm.
they're very good, but I don't know if they come across as super interesting because they still color well within the lines of bourbon, right? The sort of typical things that you'd be getting from bourbon, even wheated bourbon.
Mhm.
So that didn't quite feel like it scratched the itch of answering this question. What's your most interesting wheated bourbon? So that is sharp as ever. Definitely needs some airtime, probably some water. This is 65.65% alcohol. And if I remember correctly, the version that won the Best in Show was an even 70%. I could be mistaken, but it was higher. Definitely was higher. And that's, you know, if that was the only thing that stood out to you about this whiskey, I wouldn't blame you, right? Unlike the Balmoral, which is double oaked, I think this is just like 7 years in new charred oak in Texas. Give me an age statement. I don't see an age statement, but it is a long aging term in Texas. So you get all those classic Texas notes of oakiness, like hot temperature aging, the stone fruits like the peach and everything, and also like a little bit of like maybe espresso and like wood lacquer. Or sometimes for the less strong ones, I would say maybe like paint thinner, but like not necessarily in a bad way if you're into that. Now, I'll say that super oaky whiskey is not for everyone. It's not my personal favorite thing. But what I'll say about Garrison Brothers is they're very good at being Garrison Brothers. They've decided that they're going to make super oaky, even double barreled Texas bourbon. And they're going to do it in a way which is really well executing on that theme. So if you like super oaky bourbon, Garrison Brothers is for you. Now, it's one of those brands that suffers a little bit on value. It's very expensive for what it is. So it's hard for me to recommend Garrison Brothers, but when I get a thoughtful gift from my dad of a hard to find Garrison Brothers bottle, I am thrilled because it's a perfect gift. A good gift is one that you would not buy for yourself, right? Something you would like to have, if someone else gave it to you, but not something you would ever go out and buy, right? So the fact that this is meaningful to Dad makes it meaningful to me. And I also should clarify, I do actually like it. I just have to really be in the mood for oaky bourbon.
Oh
And
yeah.
and I usually like it better if I warm up with a couple of other bourbons first. Because I need to like acclimate my palate to that much oak. I don't usually drink oaky whiskey, right? I drink ex-bourbon cask stuff, right? I drink American single malt in refill cooperage. You know, even regular bourbon comes across as oaky for me on a normal day. And this is like 3 times that amount of oak. So definitely takes some warming up to. All right, I think we're at ASMW now.
Finished.
Finished. Yes, finished is next. Rich jumped us ahead a little bit. Okay. You go first?
Sure. Whiskey Del Bach Distillers Cut Spring 2024. This one is not one finish. This is a blend of the classic unsmoked American single malt. A blend of them finished in cognac, Pedro Jimenez, and rum agricole. So that's three finishes in one. And it is secondary finished. So technically 4 in cognac and Calvados barrels.
I also have it because this was a gift from Mark when we had him on for the interview.
Mm-hmm.
So you can see us talk
amazing.
more about this as a group. But yeah, this whiskey just is a testament to peak blending skill, really. Everything works together so well.
And
this was on my short list for this category, but Phil got to it first, so I had to pick something else.
So amusingly, it was a toss-up for me for this between this and the McCarthy's Pedro Jimenez cask finish because I couldn't decide which. And I figured that just for sheer volume of finishing, I have to go with the Whiskey Del Bach. It is so well integrated. It is, while there are some finished products where you have the core of the original product just sort of wearing a jacket of the finishing, this is one consolidated uniform. It is one whole, not one with something draped over top of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it's a well-integrated flavor profile. It's not spiky where everything stands out one at a time. You can grab onto it. It's almost hard to analyze, right? Because it's so well integrated, but it gives you just enough of, okay, that piece got a bit to shine. Okay, that piece got a bit to shine. And then late in the finish, that Calvados got a bit to shine. But yeah, overall, it's like, it is more than the sum of its parts. When I think about this whiskey, I think about all those cool things that are happening with the finishes, with that background of the mesquite malt, you know. But I don't think of it as the same as Dorado. You know, it's not Dorado plus things. It's a completely different thing. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, I mean, it is one of my favorites. I have shared a little bit with a select couple of friends, but I do not drink much of it because I want this bottle to last forever. Just because.
Samalo Is that the barrel infinite? Or is it a different infinite?
I'm just going to put that up on screen so that.
Yeah, sorry. So you know what I'm talking about. Yeah. So
Yeah.
Samela says current favorite whiskey is Take's Infinite Batch 1. I have a barrel infinite that I bought through the Our Bourbon program, which might be the same thing you're talking about. I don't know if it says batch 1 anywhere on here, but yeah. So yeah, the barrel infinite 17-year-old blended for Take, right? Is this the barrel? Is this the bottle you're talking about? The custom blend Take did with barrel. Is this not that? Just to be clear. Because this is a blend of whiskeys, you know, that includes Canadian and Tennessee whiskey and all that. Not a bourbon.
It's the
But you said finished whiskey, so yeah, this does fit. Yeah, I don't know. Might be the same. This one is very interesting. But as far as barrel goes, I actually think I like Seagrass better. That's just my personal. Yes, that is it. Okay, yeah. So this one I think needed some air. I haven't gotten back into it. I shared a bunch of this with friends. It didn't strike me quite the right way the first time I tried it. I need to try it again. I could pour it now. I don't have the specs on this one handy, but they are very... Oh, by the way, this cork is hefty. This is like metal. It's like, listen, you can hear it on the desk, I think.
Yeah.
It's like a coin. It's a really nice presentation. So since I just had... And my issue with it might have been that it was a little too oaky. So since I just had the Garrison Brothers, I think that's going to be gone now. Let's see what I think. Someone just sent me a joke relevant to some of the content of this show, but I'm not gonna repeat it because it makes fun of people who aren't us.
Was it Skip?
No.
Okay.
Someone in my local group. Yeah, you know, it's still coming across a little bit hot to me. But what's super interesting about this blend is that it's got Scotch, it's got Canadian, it's got Tennessee whiskey, it's got Kentucky bourbon, if I'm not mistaken. I think it has Indiana whiskey. I don't think it lists any states here. Oh, distilled in Tennessee, Indiana, Tennessee, Indiana, Canada, and Scotland. So there's no Kentucky bourbon in here. But it's 17 years old, which means that all of those components are 17 years plus. And this was a really good value for that. Like just that, I think it was $200, give or take. I don't quite remember. But looking at that for the age statement, 17 years felt like a good deal. And knowing that it's coming from somebody who has a really good palate. Now, you know, I tend to not like super old American whiskey, right? So like I may have been signing up for something that I wasn't particularly predisposed to, but I really appreciate what happened in this blend. It just is, it's hard for me to pull notes from it. It just comes across as really harsh for me. But anyway, so this isn't even our list. I'm just drinking something that the chat brought up.
I mean, that's fair.
So moving on, I'm trying not to lose track of which bottle was what. Did we finish with finished? No, I still have my finished to go.
Yeah.
So I naturally latched on to the same theme, right? We have some really good finished whiskeys, right? Actually, McCarthy's PX was my runner-up, basically. But ultimately, I felt that wasn't super like interesting. Because it's a peated American single malt finished in a PX cask. There's tons of Scotch that's finished in PX. It's like, it's really, really good, Like it's one of my absolute favorite whiskeys. Maybe my absolute favorite whiskey. I think I rated it 94 out of 100. And there's a lot of other things I haven't rated that I should rate. So it's entirely possible that something has upstaged it as my favorite whiskey, period. But I felt like it was very straightforward when I was actually thinking about it. Like McCarthy's cask strength without a finish may be more interesting because you can catch so many of the little nuances of the Gariana and the distillate and the peat that you don't necessarily get when they're combined with a finish. So I almost picked my very first bottle of McCarthy's, which was cask number 70. Single cask strength, super bitter, tastes like pop rocks, like raspberry pop rocks and old library books. And just that flavor profile is super interesting. But we're talking about finished whiskeys here, right? That would have been for an American single malt, but I had a more interesting American single malt as well. So so for finished, of course, I picked an American single malt as well. We're leaning heavy into American single malt whenever we can, basically. So the Cedar Ridge Quintessential Port Side, which is similarly a multiple finished whiskey. So first fill ruby port, first fill Amontillado sherry, and virgin French oak casks for 6 years. The French oak brings this buttered popcorn note in the background, plus a little bit of just like a chocolatey kind of flavor to it, right? And that plays so nicely with the port. And what I understood from Murph was that the Amontillado sherry was a bodega cask as well, or a cask, not necessarily a bodega cask, but a cask that held the sherry for a significant quantity of time. Mm-hmm. Something along the lines of a transport cask, as opposed to a prepared for the whiskey industry sherry cask. It was drinkable sherry that came out of that barrel. Right. So one of the great things, this is a great value considering I think the cask spec on it should be more expensive than it is, in my opinion. Other people disagree. That's totally fine. And the other thing is that all those components play so well together, and just like the Delbach, you can taste every one of those components, but they don't stick out. It is a cohesive whole. It is absolutely still a Cedar Ridge whiskey. Just really, really good stuff.
I'm really sorry. Port side on the label immediately made me think of Captain Quint from Jaws. And I'm sure that Murph gets that all the time, and I don't want to be rude. But I could just hear in my head Captain Quint saying port side, and it just...
I mean, as a person who paddles on a lake and steers boats for, a hobby, as well as all my other hobbies, it's hard not to think of port side as being a nautical call, right?
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, this is, whenever I pour this whiskey, it's super intense. At first, it's almost overwhelming. And then like a couple of seconds into it, it's just like, oh, that is one of the most delicious things I've ever tasted. And then pulling it apart is actually hard. It took some effort to get nuance from it. And I say that, I mean that in a good way. It's one of the profile is so well integrated that it's hard to reach in and pull out specific flavor notes and then subtract them in your brain so you can work on the next tasting note, right? That is a hard process with this whiskey because it's got so much going on and it's so well integrated. It's just delicious. So if you're not trying to think about it, it's just good stuff. My biggest regret so far in running this show is that when I recorded that interview with Murph, I was like 8 hours away from getting on a flight the next early morning, and I had already packed this bottle into my suitcase to go home. So I didn't get to actually sip this along with him while we were doing the interview. But luckily I had written down notes and I was able to sort of talk about it even so. Just bad timing on that one. So pro tip, don't schedule an interview the night before you have a flight. But to be fair, it was due to a last minute change. So out of my control, unfortunately. All right, what are we on next?
American single malt whiskey. And this is another one where I had one in mind and I changed it because I assumed that you would take my first thought.
Okay.
So I went with the Balcones
Yes.
peated American single malt finished in Sauternes casks.
I'm so glad that's on your list because I was sad that that ended up being one of my runners up. And I was actually thinking the same thing. I know you have that one. So I wanted to dodge that just a little bit.
Yeah.
Hello, Pit Boss. Welcome in. All right, do you want to talk about that whiskey a little bit? I mean, aside from the absolutely baller box.
Oh yeah, this is like one of my favorite. I mean, I have a handful of whiskeys that come with excellent presentation. Uh, Port Charlotte has those nice tins. The box that it's hard to see at the moment. The box that my Toll 21 comes in. The Tullamore Dew 12-year-old box. They're all great. The Virginia Distillery Company Courage and Conviction tins. I mean, lots of fantastic packaging. That's a wooden box. That's impressive. I like that a lot. It's also strangely
you don't
enough,
get that with a lot of things. You get that with Booker's.
yeah, which I
which
still
is
haven't managed to get, which is weird because everyone knows that I'm a big Beam fan. But this was the first Balcones that I ever had.
Oh, was it really?
Yes.
Wow. Okay.
This
Well, you
was
hit the ground running.
well, I mean, it was one of those you posted a link to this like and the countdown to it going live or going up for sale on Balcones' website in the Whiskey Lodge. And I was like, I've never had that. That's not a bad price. All these people from Texas are hyping it up. And it was a reasonable price. And I had to get a friend to help me get it because of local whiskey or spirits regulations at the time. So it was hard to get, but it was worth it. It is unique. It is that like big Balcones flavor, all of that, big, powerful oak, that huge smoke impact, and then that like nice sweet, like takes all the like sharp edges off and coats it in a nice slick sweet coating that really makes it a very drinkable whiskey despite being heavily peated and 59.5% alcohol by volume. I've got a little bit of it in my copper fox glass. Such good stuff.
Remind me, Phil, has the Pit Boss been in our stream before?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah, I think so. Sounds vaguely familiar at the very least. Anyway, welcome back in, Pit Boss. Samalo has thoughts that I strongly agree with. Let's just say that. Right? A fish rum Carthy's, really good stuff. Ultimately, I was very tempted to bring this one out as my most interesting American single malt whiskey, but I went a different direction on most interesting with American single malt whiskey. So hold that thought. I also have the Cataleja here. I'll be honest, I actually forgot about this one when I was making this list. So definitely in the runners up category. But we're still gonna try to YOLO together an ASMW list. Maybe at some point, not today, because we're already at almost 2 hours. We might just end up finishing this list and moving on. But those are great picks there, Samalo. Freedom Malts agrees. The Catalay has very impressive. Oh. And we have a question. Have you ever gotten sucked in by presentation? It turned out to be a turd. I think birthday bourbon counts.
Yeah, actually, you know what? Yeah. In case you missed it, and I believe that you probably did because you weren't here, this was my pick for most interesting bourbon. And it is different from a lot of the other, almost all of the picks on my list, because I don't actually enjoy this terribly much. This is basically all oak. At 12 years old, it spent so much time in a barrel that it just... Oh, this is the 2021. It is 12 years old. And I've had older American whiskeys. I've got the Van Winkle Family Reserve 13-year-old rye. Let's see. I know that I have another 12-year-old bourbon somewhere.
My mic decided to pop up and say hello while I was looking the other way. It's just like all the way up here. I feel like the easy answer to this question is Angel's Envy. And I was looking around to see if I could find anything else.
Just attacking myself with a bottle opener. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, presentation-wise, very pretty bottle, but also kind of obnoxious on a shelf, right? Finding a place for it is always hard. It ends up at the back of my cabinet, which is one reason I never drink it. I've had my bottle of Angel's Envy for longer than almost anything else. I think it was like bottle number 10. And it's still 90% full. And most of the reason for that is it's at the back of my cabinet, and it always has been, because it's just in the way.
It is, weirdly enough, one of the first things that I pour for people who are asking for different whiskeys. And it's almost always followed by me pouring the Isaac Bowman, which is
another runner-up, right? We gotta show this up. McCarthy's PX. Yeah, the Bowman, the Isaac Bowman is so much better than Angel's Envy. Same idea, way better execution. A little bit cheaper too.
Yeah, about $10 less. Which in the grand scheme of things doesn't sound like a lot, but it's enough to make a difference. At least in my personal opinion. And I know that the B-Day bourbon is a different age every year. I can't imagine it being very good at much older than 12 years old. Because...
Yeah, and Willet is basically the birthday bourbon, but taller.
Yeah.
Hey, totally not a McCarthy's shield. Yes, we will drink more McCarthy's.
Yes. It's coming up. Probably.
So, okay, I will spoiler right now. My list of most interesting whiskeys did not include a McCarthy's.
Which is what I was banking on when I went for the Balcones Sauterne cask. I was expecting that he would pick a McCarthy's for this spot. My runner-up was the McCarthy's single barrel that I have. That is amazing.
Yeah, so we were looking for most interesting, and one thing that tends to make whiskeys really good for me is when they're really interesting. But that's not all there is to it, right? Things can be interesting and it goes a little bit sideways, right? McCarthy's is just interesting enough, but everything that it does is really, really good. And on the scale of like, is this an interesting whiskey or is it a good whiskey? It's way more good than it is. It's also very interesting, but interesting is not its leading quality. You know what I mean?
If you had a scatter plot with good
It,
being here
it's
and
the crazy
interesting
hot
being here,
line, right? I'm drawing the line.
it ends up being up here, whereas a lot of things that are on our list are somewhere around here.
Yeah, more interesting, a little less on the good, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And we're both drawing our plots backwards for the stream, I guess. Which way do the lines go? It doesn't
They
matter.
go somewhere.
It doesn't matter. But yeah, anyway, like this was one of those things where I was like, well, I could talk about a whiskey I talk about all the time. That's McCarthy's. Or I could talk about a bottle that's really interesting to talk about. So that brings me to my most interesting American single malt. Do you recognize this? Seven Caves single malt whiskey. I've talked about this before.
Yeah.
So Jeff at Seven Caves is a mastermind of experimentation. He does what he wants to do because he loves the idea of it. And sometimes, actually most of the time, they come out amazing. Super small craft distillery in San Diego. Anybody who wants to interview craft distillers, like, you should try, but he doesn't do media appearances basically. But you should go talk to him. You should make an appointment and go visit his tasting room and let him give you whatever he thinks is interesting, because it's all good. Just like, don't have your mind so set on a particular style of whiskey. Just be open to the experience, because you're probably not going to get exactly what you're hoping to get, but you're going to get something delicious. And in this case, I thought he was sold out of this when I checked the website, that it just like didn't exist. There was no more of it. The website had an old batch that was sold out, and then he stopped selling them online. He basically said, I make so little of this, and a lot of the people who buy it were expecting something else and end up not liking it and complain. So I only give it to people who've tasted it at the distillery and like it. That's a great rule. So this, he only sells it in the 700 in the 375 milliliter size because he makes so little of it, right? So there's that's another thing that makes it interesting. But let's talk about what this whiskey is. So this is an American single malt whiskey, which is distilled from an unhopped, it's a fruited sour. Sorry, an unfruited sour. That's where I was going. I needed to remember the distinctions. So this is a proper American single malt whiskey, in that the only ingredients that went into it were water, yeast, and grain, and wild fermentation in this case, right? It is an unfruited, unhopped sour beer that was distilled into an American single malt whiskey and then aged in Seven Caves peated malt casks. So this itself is unpeated, but it was aged in peated casks. So this is usually, it was distilled from beer, right? When you start learning about whiskey, people will be like, oh, brandy is distilled wine. That's really simple. Whiskey is kind of like distilled beer, except that beer has hops and whiskey doesn't, right? Almost as a rule. And the TTB kind of makes that a rule, but it's a gray area. This is no gray area. This is distilled from a beer, but it's a beer style that is completely compliant with whiskey wash. So this is one of my most coveted bottles because I could only buy one tiny bottle of it, and I nurse the hell out of this thing. I have like a few sips every couple of months. It's really, really good. So on this occasion, I shall open this bottle once again and have a few sips.
Interesting. I've only had a taste of one Indian whiskey at a tasting at a store near me, and it was Amrut. And it is the only Indian whiskey I've ever tried, and it was interesting. Not my cup of tea, but interesting.
Anyway, another reason I think this whiskey is interesting is because when I described this to Jason Parker, he said, "Ooh, I want to try that." So, distillers that we much respect also think this is a very interesting whiskey.
Mm-hmm.
You really get a fruitiness from the sour beer, and you get just a hint of peat coming through as like a canvas. It's a really well balanced whiskey, and it's a shame that more of this doesn't get produced. So this is, in a way, this almost counts as unicorn because it's so limited and almost nobody even knows it exists. But I don't quite feel that that's the sense of a unicorn. Instead, I think that this is my most interesting American single malt by far.
Mhm.
It's not necessarily my favorite flavor profile. It's very good, very, very good. But this is, again, like Phil was saying, most of the things on our list here are things that are way far to the right on interesting, and not quite necessarily so high on our favorites, right? Not always. I mean, like, a lot of these are our favorites. That's the nice thing about bringing these categories in, is that, like, it's like a constrained writing assignment, right? In a way, like you get better results because of, yeah, more of a white whale, not a unicorn. Well, so that's the thing. Like, unicorns don't exist, right? This is a lot of people. Some person decided to argue with me on the internet one day, and I just wasn't having any part of that conversation. I was just like, I use the term unicorn. I don't care. Like, you have a problem with that term, fine. But, like, I see the point. Unicorns don't exist, right? So when people say unicorn, it should be a bottle that doesn't exist, right? In that sense, this is so limited, right? Like, you can't buy this anymore. And the previous batch you couldn't buy long before I found out about it. They're different every time, right? He makes American single malt on occasion. He doesn't make the same thing twice. So this is rare enough to basically be non-existent, to basically be a myth, right? That, I think, makes it worthy of being called a unicorn. A white whale is something that exists, but is really hard to find.
So, I have an interesting thought on unicorns. So, specifically talking about in the world of whiskey, unicorns are sought out, placed on a pedestal, thought of to be magical things that you search after and may never attain. And I think that in that manner, they are like unicorns, in that unicorns are rhinoceroses. They're not at all what you expect. If you go looking for a unicorn and you find one and it's a rhinoceros,
right, it looks like a
you
unicorn
are
in a way.
you are going to be disappointed. And almost every unicorn bottle that I have had an opportunity to sample has fallen into that category of, man, this wasn't worth the effort. And or the expense. I could have put this in the unicorn slot. I've got the Van Winkle Family Reserve 13-year-old rye. Instead, I picked a potentially unconventional selection. And that
Sorry, I'm
one,
just popping up comments and distracting Phil.
is one that I believe was worth the wait and the cost and snagging it, because I, for a while, thought that I would likely never be able to get any because it sells out so fast when it's released. And it is it's from one of my favorite distilleries. It's a limited release. It's one batch every year. Rebel Rouser. This is a 4-year-old bottled and bond rye whiskey from Catoctin Creek Distillery in Purcellville, Virginia. I love Catoctin Creek. I've gotten to speak very briefly with Becky Harris and Scott Harris, and I have a lot of respect for them and a lot of respect for what they do. Hey, good night.
Thanks for stopping in.
Yep. And I genuinely, for a while, just sort of assumed that I wouldn't get to try any or get my hands on a whole bottle. Because, for example, in this batch, there were 246 bottles. This falls into the category of both very interesting because it is from a distillery that I love and it is fantastic whiskey and fairly unique flavor profile amongst ryes, and single release every year, hard to get. I missed out on this year's 6-year-old release just because of timing, and I finally managed to get my hands on a bottle last year, and I mean, I've consumed that much of it, so
That's definitely saying that you're paying some attention to it. Absolutely. I like that you scrambled to put both hands on it, as you said, got your hands on it.
yeah.
All right, so I like Jerm is using unicorn in the correct sense here. He had 2 unicorns. One has shown up. The first one was an all peated malt from Cedar Ridge, which we just saw the announcement from. Very excited. That sounds amazing.
Yes.
I want to get one. So like unicorn, it didn't used to exist. Now it exists. Now it's not a unicorn anymore, as you said.
Yeah.
Very, very well put. And then, some things like this, right? Like at some point, all these bottles are going to be empty, and then it becomes a unicorn because, as far as you know, it doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe somebody somewhere stashed a bottle that might show up at some point again, right?
The last unicorn.
For all I know, I'm that person that has a mostly full bottle of this, and everyone else has long since finished them, right? Because I like this one. Oh, by the way, this yellow dot, I was talking earlier about my wife going around my collection pointing at bottles that she liked. She liked this bottle. This bottle she felt appealed to her. I didn't guess that because this is a cube.
Yeah.
Right. It's kind of a cool label. It's got the 7 caves written in Chinese. Jeff's wife, I think, is Chinese from Hong Kong. Anyways. Yeah, so and the remaining unicorn is an all second fill Stranahan's. Now here's the thing. I know that could in theory exist. Right? I'm pretty sure that they have some refill casks at the distillery. But they would have to actually release it as a single cask in order for that to count as a product, right? So yeah, I'm with you there. All second fill Stranahan's would be.
I was just thinking because I have a single barrel, and I was like, oh, I should see what this says, and this does say new charred oak barrel, so it's not.
I think they're pretty committed to the being straight malt whiskey, even though they label American single malt. Similar to Westward, everything they do is technically straight malt whiskey or finished, right?
Mm-hmm.
Some, like 95% of their product releases are American single malts. And they choose to label that way if it qualifies. Some of the 2 malt series are a blend of malted barley and malted rye, for example. Jerm asks, you're saying Rabble Rouser is difficult to get? My understanding is yes, it's difficult to get.
Yes, it is 1 release per year. It is almost, I think there was 1 year where it was 2 barrels, but most years it is a single barrel. So, for example, 246 barrels from the release that I have. And if you don't get it, usually within the first day or 2, they're gone. And occasionally you see them on like the Pearson's website. But the last time that I attempted to buy one from one of those liquor store websites, they refunded me my money and said, we're really sorry, we sold out, and didn't update the website. So
I have had a chance to taste the Rabble Rouser at a Whiskeys of the World event, and I believe I even saw it in a Total Wine once. And I didn't know, it was one of those occasions where I didn't know what I was seeing. So I I didn't take it with the appropriate seriousness. I was like, yeah, I want to own a Catoctin Creek at some point, but I was there to buy a McCarthy's that day. That was
Yeah.
the day that I bought the $70, the barrel 70 McCarthy's, which actually happened to be $70. That was back before I had a budget that looks like it looks now, where I buy multiple bottles a month. That was like the bottle of the month. I had to choose between McCarthy's and Catoctin Creek, and I knew that I wanted the McCarthy's. So unfortunately, I missed out on that. Some of these things you learn to live with your regrets.
Yeah.
So Samalo says, I have a general principle of avoiding unicorns because of what Phil mentioned, usually very disappointing relative to the effort. Arden America is the closest thing I own to a unicorn in whiskey. I've heard of Arden America. So
wasn't that a release specifically for the US as a
it was
US only
Arden
release?
American. Yeah, Arden American US only release. And apparently it's very, very good.
Oh.
It's like to the point where like people are like, can't wait until the next Arden America. And sure, you can leak into rum, right? We like rum here. We don't really talk about we don't talk about all the variety in rum, but it's a side interest at the very least. So Rum Deluxe TECC Still Strength Long Pond. Long Pond is, so I don't really know anything about that, right? But Long Pond is very good.
Mhm.
Okay, so Jerm got his rabble rouser from Sealbox.
Ah.
Sealbox is probably the easiest way to get things like that. Yeah.
Ooh, they do still have it listed on the distillery website.
And you can't get Sealbox deliveries where you are, right?
That falls into the category. They're more on top of that than a lot of people are. And there was a period where I could not get deliveries from Sealbox. I need to check to see if that has changed. But I'm pretty sure I have had a delivery from them in the past.
By the way, I did have a runner-up American Single Malt whiskey. And the reason I disqualified this one immediately, so I guess we're into unicorns, or we've just been riffing on unicorns without actually talking about our picks. But before we move fully on into unicorns, my runner-up pick that I disqualified pretty quickly was Mountain Meadow for American Single Malt whiskey. This is interesting in the sense of this is the most interesting liquid I've tasted in the category of whiskey. So I disqualified it because I already put this on a listicle. Right. My year wrap 2023 included this as my most unique whiskey. So I felt one listicle was enough. All right. Unicorns. Did you show your unicorn pick or were we just talking?
Yes. We were talking about my unicorn pick was the Catoctin Creek Rabble Rouser.
Oh, yours is the Rabble Rouser. Okay.
Yeah. Because it was my unicorn, my white whale. It was the one bottle that every year that I missed and I went to the website and it was already sold out, I kicked myself and was extremely disappointed to not get. My other more traditional unicorn pick is that I decided to go with the Rabble Rouser instead was the Van Winkle Family Reserve Rye, because it is a unicorn in the more traditional sense in that it's something that people hunt for and long for, and I found to be disappointing.
Yep.
And
fair enough.
Also overpriced, by the way, at MSRP.
Okay. So now into my unicorn, because I apparently have stalled that out long enough. This is not only a unicorn in the sense that I don't think you can find this anywhere anymore. I think they're all gone. The other people I know who had them, I believe, drank them all. This is also one of my favorite whiskeys in my collection. One of the best whiskeys I own. It is from a closed distillery. It is if I'm not mistaken, a Highland single malt Scotch. I don't know if it's Highland or someone will correct me if it's not Highland. This is from the Glen Albin distillery, pre-closure. It was distilled February 1978 and bottled in September 2004. Came into my possession in 2022. This was sitting on a shelf for 16 years. It was a dusty in the proper sense. And the friend of mine who found these in the store, they had about 6 of them, I think. He cleared the shelf. Right?
Yeah.
I think everyone else has finished theirs. Mine is half empty. So this is the Hart Brothers Independent Bottlers Glen Albin 26-year-old. 46%. Delicious. It's like loamy garden soil and caramel. Like, it's everything you could ever hope for a lightly peated Highland Scotch. And I've also stopped opening this bottle because I'm afraid of drinking it all.
That's fair. One of the things that I briefly considered as a Scotch option that I think may also qualify as a unicorn, because I don't know that it's available anywhere anymore, which I'm not going to be able to get out of its corner because I've got a barrel in the way, is the Bourbon that I have. That's also an independently bottled whiskey from Scotland. Not nearly as impressive.
This is also one of those things I don't open up on stream very often because it demands my attention, you know?
Yes.
They don't make them like this anymore. I would say this also, not only is this a unicorn, this is also a bit of a white whale as a category. Like, when I'm trying new whiskeys, I'm hoping to find this again, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Like something that scratches the same itch that, you know, I'm all about. Like, age is not necessarily better. Age is age. There's one specific place where I think age unequivocally makes things better, and that is lightly peated Scotch that is aged into the high 20s, low 30s. Something happens, and especially the old style distillate, that is just completely unique in the world of whiskey that you can't capture with younger distillate. Normally, young whiskey, really good stuff. I'm a firm defender of young whiskey, right? Young is not bad. Youthful whiskey notes in a well-crafted whiskey can be quite delightful. This doesn't have any of those youthful notes, right? But it has something else. It has something that emerges with time. Some people might call it rancio. Like that je ne sais quoi that comes from extra time in wood, especially when you've got some peat interacting, causing those esters to form, right? I held out, Jerm. I held out hope that the Notch could do this, because the Notch is really trying to be, you know, Scotch style whiskey, right? They don't have any peat in their distillate. I think they're not old enough yet, for one thing, but they're also already very expensive. It's just like, I hope that American single malt can turn out something like this eventually. We might be a decade away from it. We might be more distilleries coming up with different style distillates away from this. And there are some things that really come remarkably close to Scotch, at least younger Scotch, like, you know, low to mid teens Scotch with a younger age statement, which is nice, right? You get a whiskey that's been in the barrel for only, you know, 6-7 years, and it comes out tasting like a mid teens Scotch single malt. That's efficiency right there.
Oh yeah.
But you just can't replicate that decades of aging in a slow climate, I hold out hope. So yeah, all right, I'm going to put this away because I'm not going to stop talking about it.
So on the note of sort of younger American whiskey ending, specifically single malts, ending up sort of fighting for contention against whiskeys twice or more their age from Scotland. The McCarthy's 6-year series, uh, the 6-year unfinished, the PX finish, and the Oloroso finish.
And
All
the Lost Lantern 6-year single cask.
yes, all I would put on par with or better than the Lagavulin 16. I prefer almost for all of them to the Lagavulin 16. The Lagavulin Offerman Edition Charred Oak Cask. The first sip that I took, I think I texted, or not texted, but messaged Joe to be like, "Hey, the Lagavulin Offerman Edition Charred Oak reminds me of the 6-year McCarthy's, not the other way around." And
Right.
it's not just because I had the McCarthy's 6-year first. It was because the McCarthy's 6-year tasted like it was aiming for that flavor profile and did it better.
Yeah, and that's really saying something that, Steve McCarthy set out to make Lagavulin, right, with an American twist. And at some point, thanks to the efforts of Steve and Joe and Caitlin and all the other distillers that have been through those doors, they have come up with something which really stands side by side with Lagavulin and sometimes outdoes it. I firmly agree with that.
And I know that we talk about McCarthy's a lot, but that's because we love them so much. And they stand in a unique position where what they produce really does go toe to toe with the biggest of producers in Scotland. And I mean, one of my favorite distilleries in Virginia is Cashel. They make a peated single malt that is fantastic, but it's so young, it can't really find its footing against even the 5-year Ardbeg Wee Beastie in terms of completeness and fullness of flavor. And I think that a few more batches and they'll be there. But I can't think of anyone else that's really doing something that is comparable, because there are a lot of people who are doing things that are not at all comparable, that are able to sort of stand on their own against those juggernauts.
Yep. Samalo, you're still here. Completely agree. Clear Creek is putting out world-class spirits, says Samalo. And since you're still here, I'm going to say that I've been giving the Barrel Infinite blend some air, and I'm coming back to sip on this a little bit. And definitely once it gets some air and it stops being quite so spiky, it's a very nice blend. It's very complex, and I think it's probably the best. I want to say this is majority American whiskey, if I remember correctly, but it doesn't give proportions on the bottle. The spec somewhere had it. For 17 years old, American whiskey is usually much more oaky and much more unpleasant. This is downright nice. And the thing that was working against it is really just the fact that it's almost 61% alcohol. And American whiskey at 17 years old, it just punches hard. It's as hard to taste through as something like the Garrison Brothers. In fact, even with the Garrison Brothers as a contrast, like they both are just punching so hard, Anyway, I'd been meaning to give the Barrel Infinite another crack, so thanks for encouraging me to do that today. Well, all right. We've spent 2.5 hours, starting half an hour late, going through our 7 whiskeys each and a whole bunch of runners up. It's entirely possible our style of content doesn't understand this kind of assignment. We go deep on everything we talk about, and talking about 14 whiskeys is a lot.
Yeah.
So we're definitely not getting to our list of most interesting or best single malts today, American single malts today. We're already on borrowed time, so we just don't have time for it.
Yep.
And you're gonna have to take the Virginia only list to the Ranger's Respite.
Yes.
And probably don't spend an hour on it.
No, I try to aim for about 15 minutes max. I fail occasionally, but I do try. I just want to, before we go, talk about the Virginia Whiskey Tournament because I'm trying to plug it everywhere. This is the 3rd year that I've run it. The trophy has arrived. It is a Jefferson Cup, as it is every year. Neatly engraved with Virginia Whiskey Champion 2024. We've only completed two bouts. And moving on to the second round is Deep Creek and Springfield Distillery. And polls are still open for bouts 3 and 4 on Twitter and Instagram. I'll put links in the description when the video is up as a video on demand on YouTube, which will probably be pretty much immediately after this. You have until midnight on Friday to vote. So I encourage voting. Tell your friends, vote for your favorite Virginia distillery. There are some fantastic competitors in these bouts.
Yep. YouTube social tab also?
I'm using that for tiebreakers because it does not get traffic.
Okay, fair enough.
But I am at Ranger's Respite on Instagram. If you look me up, you'll find the polls. The Ranger's Respite on YouTube, Drinking Geeks on Twitter if you still use Twitter. And I think that covers that. I think that hits every base that we were hoping to hit tonight.
Yeah, so since we were talking about the Barrel Infinite, I just want to put up Samalo's notes
Absolutely.
quickly one last time. Yep. He caps it for about 2 hours before drinking. Yeah, I feel like that would work. I tend to cap or let my whiskeys rest for a good long time before, especially the high proof ones, before I do any deep sensory analysis, because a lot of the time they come out of the bottle just really closed off. So I agree with that approach. Capping it for 2 hours might work. At least it lets the air in the glass, and if you forget about it, it doesn't like go bad. So yeah, I don't know why I didn't like put it that way, but once you get past the spikiness, it is super light. It's surprisingly light for 17 years. That's a really good way of putting it. And you get a decent amount of champagne, butter, orange peel, and coconut. I'm honestly not getting notes from it yet, but part of that is because after tasting 8 different whiskeys, my palate's kind of fried. So I'll keep those in mind. Thanks for sharing. And thank you all for joining. I think there's not really a whole lot of room for questions, so I think we're just gonna call it with a sign off. So Phil, I was gonna avoid picking a favorite, but that's usually how we sign off. So
yeah, I'm going with what I have left in the glass, which is the Balcones peated Sultan cask.
I am going with this one because whenever this is in a glass, it is the star.
Yeah.
So, Phil, thanks for doing this with me. This was a lot of fun. Thanks, Jerm, for recommending this challenge. It was a really good way to comb through our collections and find some interesting stuff that we maybe hadn't visited in a while, and talk about it, because sometimes these interesting things don't get talked about in a general context of anything else we're doing. So, yeah, thanks. And your list was also great. But this is a show about us, so So with our favorites in the glass, Phil, thanks for doing this with me. Cheers, and until next time, everyone, we'll see you in the lodge. Good night.
Sláinte.